Dear Professor Gruner, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As the title might suggest, the present contribution deals with the normative power of Europe beyond its borders. This notion of this notion of European Union as a power that is neither military nor purely economic, but one that works through ideas and opinions and is able to impact it on what is considered appropriate behavior by other actors, has gained considerable ground over the years. For reasons that concern the time limit imposed to the presentation, I decided to restrict the discussion to the situation of the Republic of Moldova and how the European Union managed to endorse the domestic forces that support a pro-European course and the democratic processes in the Republic of Moldova against the background of what was presented just before in the previous presentation. So the main concern of this presentation would be to address the challenges of projecting the European norms and the value of the European project, whose limits were so convincingly exposed by Professor O'Neill yesterday, against the complexity of the situation in one of the states forming the EU's neighborhood. Turning to the presentation, to the core issues on the agenda of this presentation, I would like first to outline the organization. Firstly, we will deal concisely with the main tenets of the concept of normative power. So I will move very fast on this because I know that there is this time problem. Then we will attempt to explore the main features of the external governance of the European Union. Further on, we will examine the particular situation of the Republic of Moldova. And the next session will endeavor to evaluate the EU support for the democratization processes in the Republic of Moldova. So our focus will lay on the goal-stated content and ways of implementation. So the conclusions will highlight the status of the research and the most important findings up to now. As already mentioned, we will first address the concept of normative power. After extensive discussions on the EU role in the world in terms of civilian power, as proposed by François Duchesne in the early 70s, a new vision of Europe as a normative power was ushered in by Jan Manners in 2001. So, Jan Manners defined this normative power of Europe by making reference to distinctive European approach to international politics that favors diplomacy, persuasion, negotiation, and compromise. There are a number of channels for norm transfer from contagion, this meaning unintentional diffusion, going through the cultural filter. That means that the cultural diffusion and political learning in certain states and organizations is supported by the European Union. With regard to the external governance, based on the seminal study of Frank Schimmelpfennig and Ulrich Zedelmeier on the Europeanization of Central Europe, scholars stress the explanatory power of reinforcement by reward or conditionality as against the reinforcement by support, namely capacity building. As you know, in the context of enlargement, the strongest reward the EU used to shape domestic change was membership conditionality. By contrast, in the European neighborhood, conditionality works at the policy level by tying policy-specific rewards, such as market access or visa facilities, to regulatory convergence. So the EU has tried to decrease this adaptation cost by building local capacities for demanding, setting, and enforcing these regulatory institutions. By doing so, the EU transfers knowledge and financial resources to state and non-state actors in countries in the neighboring countries. With regard to this external governance, there are a number of studies, such as those from Sandra Lavenex and a lot of others. They look through different lenses to the ways in which the European neighborhood, despite its asymmetric and unilateral makeup, is melted down into the everyday reality of a wide range of countries with different traditions and political systems that forms the European Union neighborhood. These external governments tend to follow a two-tiered logic of building networks, a regulatory one and an organizational one. The regulatory processes allow for the extension of norms and rules, whereas the organizational processes contribute to participatory openness in decision-making. So, with regard to the case of the Republic of Moldova, we need to mention that irrespective of how relevant these theoretical frameworks are for the analysis, the capacity of the European Union to support the changes in its neighborhood, they need to take into consideration the situation on spot. With regard to the Republic of Moldova, we consider that there are a certain number of problems that we need to take into account. First, we need to mention the communist legacy, then having to carve its own way out from the Soviet system, the Republic of Moldova found itself after the 1990 in a difficult situation, as after decades of having its citizens accustomed to the idea that it was the state who had to cater for their well-being and also provide them with health, housing, and education. Nowadays, people we have to take into consideration that people with an awry and exaggerated conception of the state, with an almost unconditional obedience towards it, represent a difficult starting point for the newly proclaimed republic. Because the conference is held here in the capital city of Germany, please allow me to draw very briefly a parallel with the difficult situation faced by this country at the end of the Nazi dictatorship. Having to carve its own way out from the Nazi regime, the first German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, acknowledged the difficult situation in which his country found itself by stating, "The German people suffered for decades in all their strata from a false conception of the state, of power, and of the position of the individual person. They made the state into an idol and raised it on an altar. They sacrificed the individual and his or her worth and dignity on this altar." I quoted from memoirs of Konrad Adenauer. For Adenauer, it was clear that democracy could not be created only by establishing a parliamentary form of government. This needed to be enshrined in the consciousness of individuals, the role of state being to awaken the creative forces of the people, to lead them and to protect them, and to raise the youth to political responsible people, not in the direction of a readiness to let themselves to be controlled and ruled, but to a willingness and ability as free men to responsibly integrate in the whole. Again, I quoted from Adenauer. What would be the next problem with the Republic of Moldova? I consider that there is an unfinished process of forging a national identity. I will move very fast because we have already a very good presentation on this issue. I will just mention a brief quote from the late Professor Pompiliu Theodor, who said that by being annexed in 1812 by the Russian Empire, Moldova remained untouched by the national movements that swept to the neighboring regions, thus being barred from carving out its own national identity. Then I would like to mention briefly a quote from Charles King, who wrote a book on Moldova and its situation. And he stated that the situation of Moldova is compounded by the disputes between the country's political and cultural elites with regards to the basis of the state's national identity. And I think this was most convincingly presented in the previous presentation. Then we will have to look at Moldova as part of a common neighborhood between the European Union and Russia. Competition between Brussels and Moscow has crystallized in the region around two mutually exclusive integration projects, the Eastern Partnership and the Eurasian Customs Union. These difficult EU-Russia relations have their roots into two interconnected factors. First, the misperceptions developed between Russia and the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union that paved the way for confrontation rather than cooperation. Second, the crisis stems from actions taken by Russia as a result of these perceptions or misperceptions. In other words, Russia has made systematic attempts to destabilize countries seeking closer integration with the European Union and NATO, and has increasingly used coercion to safeguard its influence in the post-Soviet space. I will not go in very far into the history of the Republic of Moldova. I just want to mention that a few dates that are relevant for this presentation. After 2009, a pro-European coalition of parties undertook the mission to take the decisive steps for launching the country on an EU orbit, but the lack of political will to usher in the necessary reforms for a more democratic style of governance made Moldova plunge by the end of 2015 in a deep political crisis, and the credibility of European orientation to fall to record low levels, as was already mentioned. This setback is even more dramatic if we take into consideration that it comes in sharp contrast to a period when Moldova was regarded as the true champion of the Eastern Partnership and a success story in a region where Russia reasserted resolutely its own interests. With regard to the current situation in the Republic of Moldova, as most of the other CIS countries, the Republic of Moldova also, it has adopted some elements of democracy without, however, to complete its transition, is regarded as a semi-free, bearing combined elements of democratic competition and authoritarian leadership. According to Freedom House Nations in Transition Index, the Republic of Moldova should be considered rather a hybrid regime than a transitional one, as it has witnessed limited democratic progress with recurrent lapses into more authoritarian tendencies. Moldova has failed to capitalize on the window of strategic opportunity open to it by the competition between the West and Russia for the EU's eastern neighborhood, and then by the Russian annexation of Crimea. Its elevation against this background to the status of champion of Eastern Partnership, the signing of the association agreement and its awarding with a visa-free regime were supposed to be incentives for more thorough, genuine reform course, not the one mimicked by its leaders. Then again, with regard to this present situation, as already mentioned, what we have now, after 6 years of a pro-European coalition government, we have a decrease, a sharp decrease into the support for the European integration. These numbers are taken from the public barometer of the Institute for Public Policy in Chisinau. And now I would like to draw the attention to a situation where, again, I will quote from Professor O'Neill, anxiety might turn into anxious-led politics, if I take it correctly. So, this anxiety may well turn in political capital for a Russian alternative, and I think this is the most worrying sign.
You've got another 5 minutes.
Okay. So, with regard to the present situation, if we look at the pro-European civil society organization from the point of view of where they started back in the 90s, we can present this situation as remarkable, their situation as remarkable. The Moldovan National Platform of the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum has initiated both collective and individual actions towards promoting the advantages of European path for Moldova. This platform also signed a statement about the recognition of the prospect of European membership for the Eastern Partnership states, and this was addressed to the Eastern Partnership Summit in Riga in 2015. However, if we look at these civil society organizations against the background of the deep crisis in which the Republic of Moldova plunged last year, their situation looks, the situation of these civil society organizations looks a lot less spectacular. So, the banking crisis and the high-level corruption have increased social discontent and triggered radicalization in the society. The rallies in front of the government headquarters to protest against the oligarchic regime in May and September 2015 at the initiative of a civic platform called Justice and Truth exposed, however, the limits of civil society organizations' coordination capacities. Then, we have to take into consideration the growing gap between pro-democracy civil society organizations and the pro-governmental alliance. What is, however, more concerning is the increased assertiveness of the pro-Russian NGOs. The most active of them are the Recognition Fund, Fond Priznanie, and Russian World, Ruski Mir, set up in Moldova in 2009 by the Russian Federal Agency for the Commonwealth of Independent States, Compatriots Living Abroad, and International Humanitarian Cooperation. So, what has the European Union done in support for this civil society organization? From the beginning, the EU support for civil society organizations in the Republic of Moldova has been many-faceted and holds to the view that the existence of a civil society needs a democratic setup that ensures civic freedoms, and at the same time, the functioning of democracy necessitates an active and dynamic civil society. There were a certain number of frameworks for cooperation and for forging this support for the civil society organizations. They were built in a number of documents that shape these relations of the European Union with neighboring countries. So I will just mention very briefly what are the real instruments that are used by the European Union for supporting these civil society organizations. So we have a European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. This is an indirect form of support, as the grants are channeled through projects run by local civic bodies and other international governmental and non-governmental organizations. Then we have this European Neighborhood and Partnership Instrument. Around 30% of this instrument is devoted to democratic development and good governance, but again is an indirect form of support. Then we have non-state actors and local authorities in development. This is a thematic program funded under the Development Cooperation Instrument, but it applied to Moldova only starting with 2011, so the funding was very modest. Then we have an Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum that is actively funded by the European Commission. However, the support limits to the annual meetings of these forums and the functioning of the steering committee. Last but not least, we have the Neighborhood Civil Society Facility. This was supposed to be a more direct form of support for the civil society organizations, as it is run by EU delegation in Eastern Partnership countries, but there is a co-funding criterion that made this really difficult to be accessed by the civil society organizations. Then we have a European endowment. Okay. For democracy, and this is just a quicker and flexible support for a broader range of actors, and it started in 2013. So I will jump to the conclusions. Then the civil society organizations, so that were supposed to support these democratic processes from within, from bottom up, yeah. There are mostly pro-European at this date, but there are some serious concerns in this respect. They are divided and showed limited capacity to exert control over power holders. Then we have the support of the European Union for civil society organizations. So our research showed that this is rather indirect. Also, it evolved considerably, but is still in great demand. Also, is time-consuming and burdened by very complicated procedures. With regard to the European Union, we consider that it will continue to be influential in its neighborhood in the long term, only if it is able to constantly adjust to the region's environment and to address short-term challenges in a timely manner. However, too often the EU sticks to its long-term approach without being able to adjust its response when developments on spot demand prompt or firm reaction. European Union needs to maintain its integration and market model economically and politically attractive. As a matter of fact, there are only two routes along which the European Union can move in this respect. On the one hand, it can hold off the advances towards full membership, declares these ambitions unrealistic, or it can start, as with Turkey, negotiations that ultimately stagnate and lead to significant tensions. The reality shows that an engagement broken off late in the day leads to more bitterness than an advance rejected early in courtship. So, advancing on the route of full membership is not regarded as a truthful option nowadays, as a too hasty accession of the Central and Eastern European countries is still regarded in certain circles as an essential source of contestation of European political and economic situation, which translates into electoral victory for populist parties. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.